Ancient Egypt. Egypt of the pharaohs. The sort of history we've all grown up with. This is the story of how old-fashioned history is being challenged by new archaeology, and how this new archaeology is digging up a very different past for us.
That's it really, isn't it? World archaeology on a great scale. None of your dinky green mounds in Dorset. This is it, baby. This is coffee book archaeology. The Temple of Dendera, of Hathor in Upper Egypt. You've got thousands of people coming off the boats on the Nile, running around the temple. The guidebooks will tell you, the history books will tell you, this was dug in the 1860s by the great Frenchman Auguste Mariette. He dug out this huge temple built when Jesus was alive in Jerusalem. On the back wall is Cleopatra. Elizabeth Taylor herself on the back wall there. Her son Caesarion's in front of her, the son of Julius Caesar, the very last pharaoh of Egypt. So it's all big deal history, big deal surroundings. You've got a history of wars, of battles, of dynasties, the whole big deal. Classic 19th century archaeology, classic 19th century history.
To excavate these great monuments, archaeologists like Mariette destroyed entire cities, like those of Dendera in the times of the Greeks and Romans, the Christians and the medieval Arabs.
It's a bit like a bomb site, you know. It's as if the temple has been absolutely scoured out. They've been looking for just to leave what they want, and everything else has been buzzed over the wall. Look, there's a bit of a vase that's made in the time of the Ptolemies. That's from the time of the temple itself. This, though, is a bit of Arab pottery. It's 1,000 years later. You know, there's hardly any record of an Arab town ever being here, and yet there's so much Arab pottery here, it must have been a huge town. Oh, now there's an interesting little bit. That isn't from this town at all. That is from the town of the temple down there. That's from a piece of a ancient Egyptian blue glazed pot. Faience, they call it now. You know, when the tourists first came to this temple in the 1850s, they used to give you a little shovel on the boat. You could come out here and dig your own antiquities out. That's a nice thought, isn't it? Something flashing down there, look. I wonder what that is. That's a little weeny little piece of obsidian. That's a sort of volcanic glass. God knows what age it is, I don't know about that, but they were making and importing stuff like that here for a very long time. Somebody's bones bleaching away in the sun, look at that. There's little cemeteries in these walls. They're from the Christian times too. You see, when Mariette dug out this temple, he made all sorts of choices. He chose to keep that bit, and he chose to lose this bit. Whole generations of people, unknown ancient lives.
The residue of all the people who have ever lived here from the time of Cleopatra has been ruined and lost, and we will never know their history.
There's no point in blaming Mariette or one of those old archaeologists. If it wasn't for them, after all, we wouldn't have the information we got. But today, you know, it's not like this anymore. We don't have those sort of great big one-man bands digging up great swathes. Archaeologists, directors, more like business managers, flying experts in and out. The technology's completely changed, and as the technology changes, so does the history they reveal.
New history is found in very different places, and sometimes by using different tools as well. We're sailing to Bodrum in southern Turkey, on a coast of 10,000 shipwrecks. One of the first new tools of modern archaeology was the aqueduct, invented by Jacques Cousteau in wartime France. Once the archaeologists dived into the sea, the rewards came quickly. Nothing less than a transformation of our understanding of the ancient Mediterranean world. The realization that it had been widely varied, multicoloured, and highly interconnected. It all began in the 1960s, when the marine historian Peter Throckmorton brought the young archaeologist George Bass to see what was going on under the waves near Bodrum. Throckmorton had mapped hundreds of unknown wrecks in the seas between Greece and Turkey, many of them more than 3,000 years old, when the Mediterranean had bustled with international trade. Here, then, lay a vast unknown treasure. To Throckmorton's great amazement, the first thing Bass did was to sit down underwater, blowing bubbles, casting an archaeological eye over this previously unseen past.
The time is so valuable that Peter wanted me to be doing something, and I was doing something. I was thinking about the wreck. The major problem we faced, I realized it very quickly, is that on land you can work 12 hours on your site every day. Underwater we could work only about an hour a day and 2 dives. It was a different world, and we had to really invent new ways of taking land techniques to the bottom of the sea. You have to be very efficient, and we spent the entire 1960s trying to devise methods of mapping with stereophotography and things that would speed up the work and make it more efficient.
The next 20 years saw the full development of underwater archaeology. Like land archaeology, the thing was not just to take treasures from the seabed, but to map and plan all surviving objects where they'd lain since ancient times. Only then could Bass resurrect the ancient reality, the shipping, trade and tragedy upon an ancient sea. Bass's extraordinary excavation in the 1980s for Bronze Age merchantmen that had been wrecked off Ulu Burun on the southern coast of Turkey brought underwater archaeology into the very mainstream of modern histories.
Oh, wow.
Well, I can say that this ship was definitely coming from Cyprus, because this is all Cypriot pottery.
So when you moved from land archaeology to sea archaeology, underwater archaeology, did it actually change the way you saw the past, the things you were digging up?
It did, because we find things underwater that are seldom preserved on land. For example, on this Bronze Age ship that sank at Uluburun around 1300 BC, we found that they were carrying spices. So we had cumin, and we had safflower, and we had sumac, and also a jar of whole pomegranates, and we had figs, and we had grapes. You don't find those things so well preserved on land. So we're seeing the minutiae of trade, and it was carrying materials that are simply never found on land, because once they had reached port, they would have been manufactured into something. They were trading raw materials. On land, you don't find the raw tin, the raw copper, the raw glass, and all the things we're finding. They were trading even when they were warring. We find out that there were ships trading peacefully between warring peoples.
Just
because,
like now.
Exactly. You make a profit, you make a profit.
Goodness.
We have some of the 350 odd copper ingots. Each weighs about 60 pounds. They're from the island of Cyprus. And it was just a way of shipping raw copper. We also had a ton of tin ingots, so together it made 11 tons of bronze. I think this was a very major royal shipment of perhaps a royal gift from one king to another.
Perhaps more nearly the arms trade, perhaps.
Yes, yes. Somebody actually estimated how many arrowheads, how many swords, how many daggers could be made with 11 tons of bronze. You know, hundreds or thousands of weapons. It's quite extraordinary.
Good, real treasure.
It was archaeologically so rich. 18,000 catalog objects, and up in the laboratory it's going to take a decade or more to conserve them all.
At Bodrum Castle, where Bass stores his finds, a large staff works to free the excavated objects from the deposits of the ancient sea, calcium carbonate. It's a lucky dip, No one knows what they'll find inside the chalk they cut away. The green stains are from the copper ingots that the ancient boat was carrying.
I mentioned that it was carrying raw materials. For example, we have here an ostrich eggshell. And these were turned into fancy canteens by the insertion of a spout made out of silver or something like that.
Wow.
And then we have lots of raw ivory. This is part of an elephant tusk. We keep it wrapped up at the moment. But we also have 12 hippopotamus teeth. Another raw material which was not known to exist before our excavation are these ingots of glass. We had almost 200. And this was a great puzzle to us. It's a ceremonial mace head from Romania. And we had no idea what it was, but they're made there. And so we have a Black Sea connection, we have a Baltic connection, we have a tropical Africa connection, Syria,
Half the world.
Italy. We have an Italian sword. It never ends.
After months of deep and dangerous diving, Bass's team was rewarded by a cache of gold, found still lying in the captain's cabin beside a pair of jeweller's weighing scales.
I don't believe it. It's like a Egyptian vulture pendant, but it's not Egyptian.
The greatest treasure of Ulu Barun, however, was not made of the glinting yellow metal.
In all of Homer, there's only one mention of writing in the Iliad and the Odyssey, and it's a line in the Iliad, and it said, "And he sent him off to Lycia with baneful signs written in a folding wooden tablet."
Wow.
And no one thought that these writing tablets existed in the Bronze Age at the time of the Trojan War.
Isn't that extraordinary?
In a way, it's the oldest book ever found. It's made of boxwood, and the faces are scored to hold beeswax, and they wrote with a stylus on the beeswax, and then with the ivory hinge, they closed it, and they had a little clasp. And since the wax is gone, we don't know if this said, send troops, we're surrounded, or if it simply said this piece of pottery contains so many pecks of pomegranates, because this was found in a large jar of whole pomegranates.
Was it really?
Yes.
Good Lord.
So to me, this is more interesting than some of the gold jewelry that we found.
The real treasure, so modern archaeologists would say, is the window that Bass has opened on an unknown section of the past. If boat building and seafaring are still an important part of life today in the Eastern Mediterranean, how much more important were they for the ancestors of these boat builders, 2, 5, and even 7,000 years ago?
We can't imagine a world without ships. We can't imagine it. There would be no one knowing civilization. Nobody could have got to Crete 6,000 BC. Ships were more important to these people than almost anything, and yet any book on archaeology has about roof tiles and safety pins and pottery and scrapers and so forth, but not anything about how the ships were built. But Athens could not have existed without the ships that brought it food. Rome could not have existed without the ships that brought grain. I truly believe that in the first half of the 21st century that our most astonishing discoveries will be made on shipwrecks because of what we've already found in the last 20 and 30 years.
New archaeology is finding a new past, looking at the lives of ordinary people, of ancient fishermen and farmers, as well as those of queens and kings. It's re-examining old and famous archaeological discoveries as well, along with the original interpretations of the archaeologists who found them. The world-famous Palace of Knossos on the Isle of Crete was excavated over a 25-year period from about the turn of the century by Arthur Evans, later Sir Arthur, for his work here. Evans was especially interested in the beginnings of Greece, the spring, he said, of the ancient world. What he found, though, was something yet more remarkable, an entirely unknown civilization with wonderful paintings, pottery and sculpture, the first literate people of Europe.
Arthur Evans came to the island and walked over it for 4 or 5 seasons before settling on this large hill here. There were stones like these sticking out the ground, and on them there seemed to be marks which to Evans might have been the first Greek writing. So he bought the whole hill. He was a very wealthy man and started to excavate. But you know, even as he started the work, his mind was already full of the great Greek myths concerning Crete, about King Minos and the Minotaur and the Labyrinth and Theseus and Ariadne and all those marvellous Greek stories that he'd been taught as a child in school. As soon as Evans started to excavate the rooms inside this huge set of buildings he'd found, he started to give them labels. It was immediately a palace, the whole thing. The big rooms were called the chambers of the king, the medium-sized rooms were called chambers of the queens, tiny little rooms were called guard houses. To go along with the palace and the king, he actually gave them an empire too. But of course in the ancient world it was well known all the empires on the land were taken up. So his civilization was given an empire of the sea.
Evans named the ancient people that he'd found Minoans, after his legendary King Minos. And year by year, as he excavated, he rebuilt his ruins as the Palace of Knossos, capital of a mighty empire. Today, it's one of the showpieces of world archaeology, visited by millions every year. It is, in fact, a dream, a vision built by an Edwardian gentleman.
In all fairness, it should be said that Evans was facing a really extraordinary archaeological dilemma. Got to remember that when Evans started to work here, this was just a gently rolling hill covered with earth and grass. That stone up there, above this column, was actually just sticking out the grass. Now, when Evans started to dig around it, of course, he came across a wall, and as he dug down, he came across a staircase. And as he went down further, he suddenly realised that there was a whole building buried in the ground. Trouble was, it was incredibly unsafe. Unless he actually restored it as he excavated, he'd have been killed along with all his workmen. The root of the problem lay in the way the ancient people had actually built the palace in the first place. They'd used a system of wood construction supporting stone walls, and the wood had all rotted away, and the walls were now being supported by the loose earth, which Evans was taking out. So everywhere there was traces of an ancient beam, like along there, Evans had to replace with steel and concrete. It was the same for all the pillars. He built the lot. When it came to restoration, to remaking Cretan palaces, Evans really took the bull by the horns. He made the palace again, or at least he made the palace of his vision. A sort of warm, sun-filled place for young men and young women to dance through. You've got to think, this was the age when Europe really discovered sun and sea and sex. Picasso was going to the Riviera, Corbusier was preaching the merits of walking naked in the sunlight. All of Europe was excited with it. And it started an enormous tourist industry for Crete, because all the tourist boats going around the Mediterranean suddenly turned up at this very poor island, especially to see Sir Arthur Evans' dream world.
It's hardly surprising that Evans called a fragmentary painting of a Minoan woman La Parisienne. At the time he brought her into the daylight, her lipsticked mouth seemed to be the very essence of continental chic. All in all, modern Europe was rather pleased to have found such fashionable, such very friendly ancestors.
In the 1970s, Evans' image of Knossos as a sort of Riviera paradise with added empire really took a nasty knock. What happened was that an archaeologist working in one of the palace storerooms found the bones of two small children. What was really chilling was that there were marks on the bones showing that they'd been very carefully and very expertly butchered. These two children had therefore probably been eaten. Cannibalism at Knossos. What a thought. A lot of professional archaeologists actually refused to believe it. And then just a few years later, the body of a bloodless youth was found with his throat cut, still lying on the altar of a Minoan sanctuary. Clearly, this was a part of the Minoan kingdom which Evans had never dreamt of.
Pretty soon, it wasn't just Sir Arthur's restoration of the palace that was crumbling, pounded by tourists and the weather. It was his vision of the ancient world as well, and that of his entire generation too.
The basic question is this place that millions of people come to every year, peer through the gloom to look at that chair? The basic question is it a throne? Is this a palace? Is this the king's chambers? There's 2 or 3 of these painted chambers in the palace like this. Some are a little bigger, some are a little smaller. But there is not one label here to tell you what it is. Think about what a palace is. It's a place not only the king lives and has his official throne rooms and all the rest of it, he also has his bodyguards, his transport, perhaps armoured walls around it, a sort of a fortress, something like that. There's none of that at Knossos at all. What there is acres and acres and acres of storerooms. And these few little sacred chambers with a few benches, a few seats, and a few instruments that you could fill with water for some sort of ceremonial. Now that would imply to an anthropologist that what you've really got here is a sort of sacred storeroom area, that this in fact is a temple set in a sacred valley and is receiving the produce of half the island. This is an extraordinary place and we're not really understanding what it is. These old 19th century labels don't help very much. They don't help very much with the idea of an empire either. This idea of a sea empire is pretty daft. It really is only to do with the fact that the Minoan style you can see in other islands. You can see it in Syria, you can see it in islands close to Italy. But then you can see the influence of the Palace of Versailles in London and Austria. It doesn't mean that Louis XIV ruled there too. So the whole thing is really starting to collapse. Like Arthur Evans' grand creation here, it's all ideas and hang-ups too from the 19th century.
In the early 1990s, new archaeologists working in Egypt uncovered something that shook the very foundations of the traditional image of the ancient world. At Tel el-Dabba, in a part of Egypt far from Pharaoh's great grand temples, in the damp soil of the Nile Delta, Professor Manfred Bietak of the Austrian Archaeological Institute excavated enormous murals painted by ancient Cretan artists working deep in Egypt in a pharaoh's palace. Here was amazing evidence of a huge exchange, a bonding, an appreciation even, shared by the people of 2 individual ancient cultures.
We've collected 400 boxes of Aegean wall paintings in Tel Daba, which is approximately the same, if not more, than whatever has been found at the Palace of Knossos. And it's from an earlier period than Knossos.
The ancient world is much more fluid than the history books have told us, really, it seems to me.
Yes.
Egypt here, Crete over there, and then suddenly Crete and Egypt.
It was entirely unexpected that the ancient civilizations were much more interlocked with each other than we originally envisaged.
Professor Beatark's team are reconstructing a frieze of Cretan toreadors, just like one Evans found at Knossos, by placing the excavated painted fragments onto a modern reconstructed grid.
We have here an bull with an acrobat on top of it. Perhaps it's a bull grappler with a Minoan seal on his wrist, and you can see the curls streaming from his hair.
So that's an acrobat's leg. Comes down here, and there's his head and body. My goodness, Professor Beatark, you really have to look at these things very closely to see what's going on.
Nobody knows what a painstaking work it is to piece all these fragments together. Thousands of working hours.
It's such a touching past. When you go to Karnak or the pyramids, it's so enormous and permanent. And here the things are so fragile and so small, but just as significant.
At Tel El Daba, Professor Beatark is also excavating parts of Pharaoh's Egypt hardly ever seen before. Evidence of foreign towns and palaces lie beneath these onion fields, brought to light by skillful archaeology in a land where excavation has traditionally consisted of shoveling sand and reading hieroglyphics.
So when you look at this now, you can see this great building, can you?
You have to imagine that to our right, within this clover field, there was an enormous palatial construction.
Now you're digging the palaces here. That's a sort of Egypt that nobody's really looked at before, is it? I mean, it's like an unknown ancient Egypt. It's not Karnak, it's not the pyramids or the great temples, but it's another one where people lived.
Yes, I think this is very important because the Delta is a neglected area in Egyptian archaeology. Our vision of ancient Egypt was mainly forged by generations of archaeologists who dug up tombs and temples and who recorded meticulously inscriptions. So our vision of ancient Egypt is a funerary one or a religious one. And what was the other side, we know to some extent, but we don't have very many records of it.
Whilst archaeologists like Professor Beatark are excavating pieces of a brand new past, others are looking again at the grand old temples, tombs and pyramids, looking through the cliches, through the postcards, re-examining traditional interpretations of the courtly past. This is the great state temple of Ramesses III at Thebes in Upper Egypt, built in the 13th century BC. Its golden texts and pictures were the inspiration for an influential theory of Professor Gaston Maspero, a French archaeologist who, in the 1870s, interpreted these images as a Shakespearean tale of pirates and patriots, of invaders and defenders, a moral tale for 19th century schoolrooms that long dominated archaeological histories from India to Europe.
This is the administrative centre of the nation. Down one side there's taxes, down the other side, well, wars. It's a bit like newspapers really, and if you believe newspapers, you believe this place, you'll find there's a whole history here. It's also sheerly beautiful, isn't it? This is really interesting. This is the first known sea battle in history. And there's Pharaoh standing on his enemy with a bow and arrow, shooting at the enemy boats which are coming down the small rivers of the Nile Delta. It says that Pharaoh destroyed them utterly in the bulrushes of the Delta, and there they are, being destroyed utterly. Egyptian battle scenes work like this. All the Egyptians are working on dead regular lines because they represent order. The enemy is all over the shop. A lot of them here are upside down. I mean, it's like a Spielberg movie. You know, they're falling out, they're falling in, they're dead, they're alive. It looks like a plate of pasta. Now this is really interesting. Look, this is another battle scene. There's Pharaoh and his army tearing the guts out of another lot of invaders. Actually, the texts say it's the same lot of invaders that are in the boats, but this time they've come in carts across land and they brought their wives and children with them, and they're saying, according to the hieroglyphic inscriptions, we will settle in Egypt. And look at the cart. You see that cart with that great thick round wheel up there? Those are the same carts as Anatolian peasants in Turkey still use today.
For the best part of a century, these battle scenes were used as illustrations for a general theory of invasion. A theory that claimed that waves of mobile warriors had attacked and changed the ancient cultures of Europe, India and the Middle East.
So the 19th century theory went that all these foreigners came down with their women and children, having been displaced from Central Asia. All those people was part of a great wash of invasions that completely destroyed that beautiful, rich society of the Eastern Mediterranean in the Bronze Age. But is it true? Can we trust this stuff? Does Pharaoh's records really equal what we want to know as history?
Once a story like invasion theory was assumed to be true, archaeological finds were easily interpreted to tell new bits of the same old tale. From Greece to Pakistan, the ghostly invaders took on lives of their own. In 1970, the Greek archaeologist Spiro Marinatos started to look for a place to excavate in these fields. What he was searching for was a Mycenaean tomb. As Homer said, they were rich in gold. What he found, though, seemed to be yet another fragment of the invasion theory.
Doesn't look much, does it? But it is. You see, to an archaeologist, you can see that this hill is man-made. There's no way that nature makes little bumps in a great wide flat plain. For another, it's completely circular and it has a row of stones round the bottom, which is a bit of a giveaway that this is made by a man. What was underneath, though, was a tremendous surprise. And you can still see it, because, as they say, here's one I made earlier. Actually, you know, this is a real privilege. It's not often you can open a door and walk back into time. Marinatos put this great shed up over his excavations, so instead of walking over a grassy mound that's been rained on for 25 years, I'm walking in the dust, 3,000 years old and more. It's really nice. Why he did it, the important thing is that he soon realised that these mounds weren't just similar old mounds in Greece, but were something international. Something very rare. See all these stones, these pebbles that are on top of the mounds, and the particular way the walls are made means that these mounds are a type of grave called Kurgan graves. And they're found in Russia, where they date from 5000 BC, and slowly they get later and later in date and go up the Danube, they come down into Turkey, they go right down through the Middle East. It's an extraordinary phenomenon. Traditional explanation has always been that these Kurgan graves, which are a Russian word which means low mound, these Kurgan graves are made by a wandering nation of people. They had their own pottery, it seemed. And then the graves started to turn up, like this one here, and in the grave was the Kurgan pottery of a type dated between 1650 BC and 1400 BC. So Marinatos had these Asian wanderers actually in Greece. Funny people, some of them
were buried in the usual little crouch position like that guy there. Some of them were cremated. There's some grey bone, the ashes blown away. And then Marinatos really hit the pay dirt. These wandering Kurgans were supposed to be a bit like Genghis Khan and the lads with big swords, but never a horse. Look at that. 1650 BC, Marinatos said, a genuine ancient horse, the first in Greece, perhaps the first in Europe, brought from the steppes of Asia. Greek legends tell of tribes coming down into Greece, carrying the Greek language, bringing swords, spears and horses, Homer's aristocracy. Is that the Kurgans? Marinatos probably thought it was. He said that he went out looking for the Mycenaeans and found their grandparents, that these little tombs with these tiny little tomb houses in the middle of them were actually the origins of the Greek temple. This is the first Parthenon, he thought. And it was quite justified if you take on the main argument. Yet the old invasion theory is entirely contradicted by recent genetic analysis, which usually shows an astonishing stability in populations over thousands upon thousands of years. And even the traditional archaeological arguments are weak. After all, would the excavation of a Coke can from a grave in Kosovo actually prove that the people from Atlanta, USA had invaded and replaced the indigenous folk of Yugoslavia? I think not. By the 1970s, the century-old invasion theory had grown to a point where most archaeologists simply assumed that in the years between 1400 and 1100 BC, a racial invasion, a single brutal disaster, had destroyed the rich Bronze Age cities of Greece, Syria, Israel, and Anatolia. Here at Mycenae in central Greece, archaeologists found Bronze Age palaces to have been burnt, ruined and deserted at just this time. Once again, archaeology appeared to support the traditional view. Yet how strong really was the archaeological evidence of this foreign invasion?
Disasters and catastrophes, quite difficult things to find in archaeology. I mean, you can find a wall with some poor bloke squashed flat underneath it, that's pretty obvious. But for invasion theories, you need something more than that. Here's the top of the ancient wall, a very ancient stone that's been reused. There's the foundations. So you've got to imagine the ceiling up there, crash, the roof comes down in flames. And I don't know if you can see it, but there's a slight stain. It runs just through there. That's ash that's 3,500 years old. Now somewhere in here, with a bit of luck, there's a tiny fragment of ash. It's from little bits like that people have built theories of the ancient Greek race itself coming into Greece, burning the Bronze Age civilization, bringing language, art. Hitler, you know, thought that they were Germans that had come down and made this ash, and that the Greeks were Germans. Other people thought they'd come from Bulgaria or somewhere else. But that's how archaeologists build their history, out of single events. It's a classical theory, and as you can see, the evidence is pretty dodgy.
Dodgy, because all these cities had been burnt many times before. No one had ever suggested that these earlier disasters were caused by anything more than accidents or local wars. Dodgy too, because modern scientific dating clearly shows that these cities had not all burnt at the same time, but over a period of several hundred years. And there's scant evidence of any foreigners either. There'd been no single grand invasion, but the slow disintegration of an international culture, the Bronze Age, over many centuries.
You know, I think we're entitled to ask where this basic idea of invasion as an agent of change comes from. Like most things in the modern world, the answer lies in ancient Greece and its writings. Look, I'm sitting at a cafe table in Athens. Up there is the great big beautiful rock of the Acropolis. That wall at the top of it was built 500 BC, just after Greece had been invaded by Persia, and the Persians had come here and torn down all the temples and burnt them. When the Athenians got themselves back together and built that wall, they got all the old bits of the temples that were burnt and built them into the wall. You see those bumpy bits up there? They're the drums of great columns of a temple that's completely disappeared. So when every Athenian came out of his house and shuffled off to the taverna to collect his oil and wine or whatever else it was, he saw invasion advertised up on the Acropolis beside him. It was a constant theme of his life.
The idea is also in ancient Greek literature, this strict division between us and them, Greek and foreigner, set alongside themes of racial war, invasion, change and death. This ancient Greek perception, then, was passed on to 19th century Western archaeologists and to the authors of those classic history books. To them, history consisted of daily dramas of kings and wars and murder, with civilizations rising and falling like trees in a forest. That's why they treated the destruction of the Bronze Age cities as an invasion, as grand opera. The real point, though, is not that these cities were destroyed, but that they didn't rise again as they had so many times before. This was not a great invasion, but a slow systems collapse that eventually led to the beginning of the Iron Age. New archaeology is showing us so many different histories. Unknown histories where 500 years isn't only counted out in wars and dynasties, but in 25 generations of human life. In slow changes in diet, perhaps, as seen in the bones of humans or of animals, in ancient crop and field use. All this and more shows previously unnoticed types of ancient history. So in Australia, for example, and in Canada too, and many other countries, Indigenous peoples now have 40,000 years of practical archaeological narrative to set beside traditional history and memories of dream time. New history, then, uses many new types of information. And it needs new kinds of archaeologists as well.
This new archaeology is really producing the most wonderful things. Finally, archaeologists have stopped digging tiny little holes for treasure and temple and have started to look at the big picture. They're walking for miles and miles through entire landscapes, through millennia of time. They're not just digging for one period of history anymore, but for vast spans of time, the big picture. As they walk through their landscapes, they pick out things to dig. They might dig anything, pissoirs, pigsties, palaces, temples, it's all the same to them. Flint axes, polythene bags, it's all part of the big picture.
This ancient pyramid stands beside the village of San Jose Mogote in the Oaxaca Valley, Mexico. People have been living in and around this site for more than 3,000 years. For 25 years now, new archaeologists have been digging it up.
You know, this new archaeology is going to occupy a completely different space in our society to the old archaeology. Think where you have to go to look at the old archaeology. The products are found in the British Museum, the Louvre, the Met, all the great museums of the world. They've got the pick of it all, really. All the great monuments of history, everything that money can buy and armies can plunder, it's there. The new archaeology, though, it's interested in smaller things, and you're not going to have to go to these vast institutions with their marble columns to see them. Best places, perhaps, are little places like the Village Museum of San Jose Mogote. There you are. The community of San Jose Mogote welcomes you to their museum.
Village Museum. They've done it in cooperation with Dr. Flannery, the archaeologist who worked here for so many years, and the National Institute of Anthropology and History. But the important thing this notice is telling you, that it's the culture of this village, the culture of our ancestors, of our archaeological patrimony, made for future generations. It's the first case in the Villagers Museum, and in it, amongst all the flints and the relics of the first villagers from 3,500 years ago, is something the modern villagers still use every day of their life. It's a quern. It's for grinding corn. It's the basis of their economy, the yellow gold of their village. But this village grew so quickly that in 5 centuries they had artists making things as precious as this. These objects are from their temples and their tombs from that period. Look at this chap here. He once stood on the top of a pyramid. Look, you see that black spot there? That's copal incense. It sent a great smoke up into the valley when this village was the most powerful place around. There's something in the next room not quite so nice, because after some 2,000 years of getting on quite well and owning their own lands and fields, suddenly the Spanish arrive and take over Mexico. Look, there's a model of their old pyramid. Here is the Spanish hacienda. The villagers are now serfs. They don't own their own land anymore. The Spanish are sucking all the wealth out of this beautiful valley, sending it back to Spain. Well, the Spanish got their uppance, didn't they? Revolution came. These are models of the present villagers' grandparents and great-grandparents asking the owners of the hacienda, the Spanish, the Germans, the Dutch people who ran it, for more money. And they managed it, and they got it. And here are the family trees of the villagers themselves. The people marked in red are the people who petitioned in the times of the revolution to get the land back from their village. It's a dodgy thing to do. You could have got yourself shot. It's a great roll call of honour. They're the same people, the same Zapotec people that made those beautiful things in that room, that suffered under the Spanish, that fought in the revolution. It's all part of one great history. That's the gold of modern archaeology. It's the history of these people, of people like Urbano Matadamas and his wife who signed the petition, Paula.
Daniel Matadamas, Amado Matadamas, Paula Méndez de Matadamas, Francisco Matadamas, Macaria Méndez de Matadamas, Antonio Matadamas, Esperanza Matadamas, Luis Carlos Matadamas, Ricardo Matadamas Jiménez,
Nancy Paz Matadamas,
Ernestina Matadamas Luis,
Josefa Luis y mi nietecito Jesús Matadamas.
Socorro Méndez Chincoya, Nieves Cruz Matadamas.
A history for all those people, past and present, who've never had a history. An archaeology for all the human race.
Roque Hernández Hernández. Celerino Hernández Jiménez.
Delfina Méndez.
Leodoro Jiménez.
Soledad Juárez Méndez.
Ángel Méndez Jiménez.
Abisaí López Porras.
Sara Hernández López.